The first thing the orderlies noticed, though they dared not speak it above a whisper, was the way the snow on the roof of the Boston Charitable Hospital refused to melt, even when the January thaw set in and every other rooftop wept onto the cobblestones below. It lay there in a narrow, perfectly level band, no wider than a man's forearm, running the entire length of the west wing like a white scar stitched across grey skin. By lamplight it gleamed with the dull opacity of bone that has been boiled clean, and by moonlight it took on the bluish pallor of a week-old bruise. Those who climbed the service stair after nightfall swore the rafters beneath that strip exhaled a breath colder than the wind off the harbor, a breath that smelled faintly of iron filings and the sweet rot of dissected cadavers wheeled up from the basement dissecting room only hours earlier. No physician would acknowledge the phenomenon. The Board of Governors attributed it to an unusual convective eddy and recommended thicker woolen socks for the night staff. Yet the same orderlies, when they passed the locked door of Ward K at the stroke of 3, heard from behind the oak a sound like wet linen being torn slowly in two, followed by the soft click of something metallic set gently back upon a tray. They walked faster then, eyes fixed on the guttering gas jets that seemed to lean toward the west wall as if drawn by an invisible draft, and they felt the hairs rise beneath their collars because every man among them knew, without document, without testimony, without anything that could be called evidence, that the hospital had begun to measure time by a different clock, one that ran backward and dripped instead of ticking. No one had died in Ward K for exactly 19 nights, which was unprecedented in the charity's 20-year history, yet the linen supply dwindled twice as fast, and the apothecary's ledger showed repeated withdrawals of laudanum signed by a hand that resembled no living physician's, a hand too precise, too unhurried, a copperplate copied by a stylus dipped in ice water. On the 20th night, the senior night nurse, Miss Rose Dyer, spinster, Methodist, unshakably calm during the 23 cholera surge, was found seated upright on a three-legged stool in the corridor, her apron folded neatly across her lap, her eyes fixed upon the transom over Ward K as if watching something crawl across the frosted glass. She was alive, her pulse steady, but when the resident tried to speak her name she raised one finger to her lips in the universal gesture of silence, and her pupils had dilated to the rim so that the iris vanished entirely, leaving two perfect circles of black that reflected the gaslight like polished onyx. They carried her away to the physician's lodging, yet for weeks afterward attendants swore they saw her silhouette pacing behind the frosted panes of the upper corridor, barefoot, though her shoes remained where she had left them beside the stool, soles worn thin as communion wafers. The hospital said she had suffered a nervous collapse brought on by overwork, and the board voted to seal Ward K until ventilation improvements could be completed. They nailed the door shut with new pine boards that bled resin the color of dark honey, and they pasted across the seam a strip of parchment stamped with the charitable seal, a lamb couchant beneath a Latin motto none of them could translate anymore. But the board swelled and shrank with the weather, and by February the resin had turned the color of oxidized blood, and the parchment began to curl away as though something inside breathed steadily, patiently, waiting for the day when the last nail would work itself free and the door would sigh open without a hand to touch it. In the winter of 1826 the Boston Charitable Hospital stood at the edge of the north end like a reluctant bridegroom summoned too early to the altar, its fresh brickwork already soot-darkened by the coal smoke that drifted from the harbor foundries. The city like polished onyx. They carried her away to the physician's lodging, yet for weeks afterward attendants swore they saw her silhouette pacing behind the frosted panes of the upper corridor. Barefoot, though her shoes remained where she had left them beside the stool, soles worn thin as communion wafers. The hospital said she had suffered a nervous collapse brought on by overwork, and the board voted to seal Ward K until ventilation improvements could be completed. They nailed the door shut with new pine boards that bled resin the color of dark honey, and they pasted across the seam a strip of parchment stamped with the charitable seal, a lamb couchant beneath a Latin motto none of them could translate anymore. But the board swelled and shrank with the weather, and by February the resin had turned the color of oxidized blood, and the parchment began to curl away as though something inside breathed steadily, patiently, waiting for the day when the last nail would work itself free and the door would sigh open without a hand to touch it. In the winter of 1826, the Boston Charitable Hospital stood at the edge of the North End like a reluctant bridegroom summoned too early to the altar, its fresh brickwork already soot-darkened by the coal smoke that drifted from the harbor foundries. The city had raised it on the site of the old almshouse burial ground, whose unmarked graves were said to have been exhumed and transferred to Copp's Hill, though workmen still turned up shards of coffin wood whenever they sank a new privy. The founders, merchants, widows, and divines had endowed the place for the relief of the sick poor, without distinction of sect or nation, a phrase engraved above the portico in letters so sharp they seemed cut by shame itself. Inside, the corridors were laid out on the Pennsylvania model, long wards radiating from a central cupola where the matron's desk sat like a pulpit, allowing her a panoramic view of every bed. The floors were scrubbed daily with lye and hot vinegar, yet the smell of pine tar and human sorrow clung to the floorboards like a second varnish. On admission day the queue stretched down the slope toward the wharves, Irish laborious with crushed fingers, sailors whose lungs rattled with the white plague, wives scalded by kettle overturns, and now and then a child with the hollow eyes of congenital want. They surrendered their clothing in exchange for striped cotton gowns that tied at the neck and ankles, and they watched their garments disappear into the fumigation stove with the same resignation they had once reserved for burial. The hospital's charter promised restoratives, prayer, and such surgical interventions as shall be sanctioned by enlightened conscience, but it said nothing of the experiments conducted after midnight in the dissecting cellar, where medical students paid $3 a session to watch Dr. Silas Weiland demonstrate the difference between arterial and venous blood by candlelight. Weiland, a graduate of the new medical college at Bowdoin, had arrived in Boston the previous autumn carrying a leather trunk lined with velvet and a set of scalpels said to have been forged from the same Sheffield steel used to flense whales. He spoke rarely, and when he did his voice emerged so softly that students leaned forward as if to inhale the words rather than hear them. His hair was the color of fresh ash, and his eyes were set so deep that the pupils appeared to float in twin caverns bruised purple by insufficient sleep. Within a month of his appointment as physician for morbid cases, the death rate in the charity rose by 11%, a figure the governors dismissed as a statistical variance within expected mortality curves. They were more troubled by the cost of lime necessary to whitewash the cellar walls after each anatomy lecture, for no matter how vigorously the porters scrubbed, a pale pink bloom seeped through the plaster within days, as though the bricks themselves retained a memory of what they had seen. The history. The land had not always been hostile to the living. Before the almshouse there had been a rope walk, and before that a tannery, and before that a stand of white pine that the Massachusetts people called the breathing place because the needles whispered even when no wind stirred. Early Puritan surveys listed the acre as barren, thankless, and inclined to melancholy vapors, yet the town took it for a pauper's field when the smallpox epidemic of 1721 overflowed the Copp's Hill Cemetery. For a century the indigent dead were laid there in trenches, 3 coffins deep, without stone or sermon, while the living pressed close, building timber tenements that leaned together like gossips. By 1800 the ground had sunk in irregular hollows where rainwater pooled thick as soup, and mothers warned their children that if they stepped into those puddles they would dream of faces they had never seen, faces that would greet them again at the moment of their own dying. When the hospital trustees purchased the lot in 1824 they ordered the soil turned twice and twice again, instructing the labourers to mix in fresh loam from the countryside so that the dead might be cushioned by strangers' earth. Yet the foreman, a Nova Scotian named Calder, kept a private tally of the bones his shovel struck, 312 skulls, 47 jawbones still fitted with molars, 9 silver buttons bearing the insignia of the 64th Regiment of Foot, and 1 small iron locket containing a plait of auburn hair. Calder wrapped the locket in a square of oilcloth and carried it in his pocket for luck, but within a week his hands began to tremble so violently that he could no longer grip a hammer, and he was dismissed for drunkenness though he had never tasted spirits in his life. On his last night in Boston he was seen walking backward along the waterfront, addressing the harbor in a voice too low for anyone to catch the words, and when he reached the end of Long Wharf he stepped calmly into the black water without removing his boots. His body was recovered 3 days later, eyes open, the locket still clasped in his fist, the hair inside turned the color of fresh snow. The trustees buried the bones in a single pit at the center of the future north wing, poured quicklime over them, and laid the cornerstone with prayers read by the Reverend Dr. Increase Mather Sewell, who spoke of resurrection and the mercy of forgetfulness. Yet that night a frost split the cornerstone clean across, and the crack ran westward like a vein, disappearing beneath the foundation of what would become Ward K, where no patient would ever recover. The problem. The trouble began with a woman delivered to the receiving room on the eve of Epiphany, her name recorded only as Mary, Irish, estimated age 28, found insensible in Dock Square. She wore a man's greatcoat stiff with frozen blood and no wedding ring, and when the dressers cut away the coat they discovered across her abdomen a lattice of fresh scars so fine they might have been drawn with a ruling pen, each line intersecting at precise angles to form a star within a square. The scars were not inflamed, suggesting they had been inflicted with antiseptic care, yet the flesh beneath felt cold as the exterior air, and when Dr. Weiland pressed his palm against her skin he drew it away quickly, as though the cold had bitten him. The resident on duty, a shy Vermonter named Jonah Hale, wrote in the casebook that the patient exhibited no vital pain upon exploration of the wound, but uttered a low, continuous hum, pitched at B-flat below middle C, steady as a tuning fork. They placed her in the rearmost bed of Ward K, where the radiator pipes were known to clank but never to warm, and they expected her to die before dawn, for her pulse fluttered at 120 and her respiration scarcely lifted the coarse blanket. Instead she survived 3 nights, humming without pause, the note vibrating through the iron bedstead so that the patient in the next cot, a Portuguese sailor recovering from a fractured femur, began to tap the ward floor in identical rhythm with the heel of his uninjured leg. On the 4th morning the sailor was discovered dead, eyes wide, the heel still twitching though the heart had ceased, and when the nurses lifted his body they found the same faint star and square etched into the skin beneath his adhesive plaster, the lines so recent they glistened with lymph. Weiland ordered both bodies removed to the dissecting cellar for immediate post-mortem examination under special protocol, a phrase that appeared nowhere in the hospital charter. That night the temperature in Ward K dropped so low that the water carafes froze solid, splitting the glass with a sound like distant musket fire, and the orderlies found the remaining patients huddled at the far end of the ward, blankets drawn over their heads, refusing to answer when their names were called. One old man, a printer dying of consumption, kept repeating in a voice dry as setting ink, "The line is drawn, the line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." By morning the printer had vanished, his bed was stripped bare, yet the chart at the footboard bore a discharge note signed by Dr. Weiland, though the ink was still wet and smelled of iron rather than gum arabic. The descent. After the disappearance, the board convened in the governor's parlor, a paneled room that smelled of coal dust and the ghost of long-smoked cigars. They agreed that Ward K should be temporarily isolated, and they instructed the steward to move the remaining patients to Ward F, where the windows faced the sunrise and the radiator clanked like a cheerful drunk. Yet when the porters unlocked the door they found the floor slick with a film that reflected the gaslight like polished obsidian, and the air tasted of snow about to fall. The bed stood in perfect alignment, sheets tucked with barrack precision, but at the center of each pillow lay a single auburn hair curled into a perfect figure 8. The steward, a Scotsman named MacLeod who had served at Waterloo, turned pale beneath his weather-broken veins and whispered that the shape was the old sign for infinity, the Ouroboros without the serpent, which means the tale has been devoured but the telling goes on. They burned the linens in the furnace, yet the next morning the same hairs appeared, this time laid across the threshold of the sealed ward, 8 of them, arranged like the spokes of a wheel. Dr. Weiland requested permission to conduct controlled temperature studies in the abandoned ward, arguing that the phenomenon might illuminate the nature of malignant chills. The governors, weary of whispers, granted him a key and a budget, provided he file weekly reports in language suited to lay intelligence. From that day forward Weiland was seen entering Ward K at dusk, carrying a leather satchel that clinked softly, and leaving at dawn with the satchel notably lighter. His complexion grew translucent, and the students whispered that when he raised his hand to demonstrate a point in lecture, the nails appeared bluish, as if the blood beneath had been replaced by winter rain. On the last night of February, the night nurse sworn to watch him, Miss Dyer, followed at a distance, carrying a shaded lantern. Through the keyhole she observed Wyland seated on the floor in the center of the ward, surrounded by a circle of mercury that reflected the gaslight upside down. He held a scalpel in one hand and a pocket chronometer in the other, and at precise intervals he tilted the blade so that a single drop of his own blood fell into the mercury, where it sank without dispersing, forming a perfect red bead that rolled slowly around the circumference as though guided by an invisible groove. Each time the bead completed a revolution, the temperature dropped another degree, and the window panes filmed over with frost ferns that spelled out words in an alphabet Miss Dyer could not read but felt in her mouth like the taste of pennies. When the bead had circled 8 times, Wyland rose, wiped the scalpel on his cuff, and walked toward the door. Miss Dyer fled, but not before she glimpsed, in the reflection of the mercury, the outline of a woman standing behind Wyland, her hair the color of the hairs on the pillows, her face obscured by the star and square carved clear through the flesh so that the ward's gaslight shone through her head like a lantern with a broken pane. The horror. March arrived like a creditor with a duplicate ledger. The harbor froze later than usual, and iceboats carried smallpox vaccine to the islands, but inside the hospital winter deepened. Ward K's door stood ajar, though no one claimed to have opened it, and the air that drifted out carried the odor of wet stone and the metallic sweetness of old blood kept too long in a corked bottle. Wyland ceased attending lectures, his name was removed from the weekly schedule, yet his satchel continued to travel, carried now by an orderly whose face no one could later describe except to say that he walked as if hinged at the knees wrong way round. Patients in adjacent wards began to hum the B-flat note in their sleep, and the sound traveled the pipes so that the boiler room gang swore the building itself had begun to sing. On the vernal equinox, the board dispatched a delegation of 3 governors to inspect Ward K and deliver a report suitable for the trustees' spring banquet. They entered at noon, armed with ledgers, measures, and a flask of brandy for courage, and they did not emerge until dusk, by which time the brandy was untouched but the ledgers had been filled with columns of numbers that ran vertically, horizontally, and finally diagonally across the pages, forming the same star in square repeated hundreds of times until the ink bled through the paper and stained the governor's white gloves black. Of the 3, only Governor Bradley reached the banquet. The other 2 were discovered the next morning in the dissecting cellar, seated on the same dissecting table, their cravats neatly folded in their laps, their eyes removed and replaced by 2 copper pennies minted in 1794, the year the city had voted to build the almshouse. Bradley never spoke again, but at every subsequent board meeting he placed upon the table a single auburn hair weighted by the same 1794 penny, and when the clerk tried to remove them Bradley seized his wrist with a grip surprisingly strong for a man of 70, and a hiss escaped his lips that sounded almost like language reversed and played backward through a speaking tube. The hospital's finances, meanwhile, improved remarkably. Donations arrived from merchants who had never before displayed charity, and a legacy of $10,000 was bequeathed by a reclusive spinster whose will specified the money was for the encouragement of Dr. Wyland's researches into the alleviation of mortal chill. The board voted to name the new wing the Wyland Pavilion, and they commissioned a portrait of the doctor to hang in the main stair, though no artist could be found willing to sit in the same room with him long enough to sketch his likeness. The painting was finally completed from memory by a deaf-mute limner who worked with his eyes closed, and when the canvas was unveiled the assembled staff saw a figure in ash-colored coat standing before a background of falling snow that seemed, the longer one looked, to be falling upward rather than down, back into a sky the color of spoiled milk. The ending. On the 1st of May, the city awoke to find every window of the Boston Charitable Hospital shuttered from the inside, though no order had been given. The wards lay silent, even the boiler had gone cold, its gauges frozen at 32 degrees exactly. When the fire brigade forced the doors they discovered the building empty of every living soul, patients, nurses, physicians, laundresses, scullions, all gone as if translated. The beds were made with fresh linen, the drug cabinets locked, the ledgers balanced to the penny, but in each ward the pillows bore the indent of a head and a single auburn hair coiled into a figure 8. In Ward K the mercury circle remained, though the metal had solidified into a greyish crystal that fractured the light into impossible angles, and at its centre lay Dr. Weiland's scalpel, its blade dulled by some abrasive stronger than bone. The portrait in the stair had altered overnight, the face had become a blank oval of flesh-coloured paint, and the background snow now fell laterally, as though the world had tilted 90 degrees and kept rotating. Outside, the strip of snow on the roof had finally melted, but the water did not drip, instead it climbed the brickwork like a film of clear flame, evaporating before it reached the gutter, leaving the wall unstained but colder than the air around it. No formal investigation was ever completed. The trustees declared the hospitals indefinitely closed owing to fiscal exigencies, and the city sold the site to a manufacturer of bonnet wire who fenced it off and posted guards with dogs that refused to approach the West Wing after dark. Years later, when the fence had rusted away and the bricks had begun to slump back into the earth, children playing among the ruins reported hearing a woman humming a single low note that made the broken glass vibrate in the window frames. They said if you stood very still you could feel the ground pulse beneath your boots like a heart that had learned to beat backward, and if you knelt and pressed your ear to the foundation you could hear, very faintly, the shuffle of many bare feet moving in perfect synchrony, as though a ward full of patients still paced the long corridor, waiting for the door to open and the line to be redrawn, the line that separates the sick from the well, the living from the merely unburied, the told from the untellable. And sometimes, on nights when the harbour fog thickens into milk, a passerby may glimpse a narrow band of snow lying level along the ghost of the roof, white as a fresh page upon which no confession will ever be written, while the air carries the smell of vinegar and iron, and the slow, deliberate click of a scalpel being set gently back upon a tray echoes across the vacant lot like the final period of a sentence the city has agreed, forever, to leave unfinished. The archive. Years afterward, when the hospital's bricks had been carted away to fill the foundations of new cotton mills and the lot lay under a skin of weed and broken slates, the city archivist discovered a tin box sealed with wax and lodged behind the false back of a mahogany apothecary drawer sold at auction for scrap. Inside lay a sheaf of case notes in Dr. Weiland's hand, the ink faded to the colour of dried elderberry, and interleaved among them 32 auburn hairs pressed flat as though by the weight of an entire building. The paper was brittle, colder than the room, and when the archivist lifted the first sheet it exhaled a breath that smelled of carbolic acid and the sweet rot of thawing ponds. The entries began in January 1826 with the usual clinical formulae, age, sex, presenting complaint, but by February the margins crawled with diagrams of the star in square, drawn so minutely that a magnifying glass revealed each line composed of words in Latin, Greek, and something older, a script that seemed to have been invented to be spoken only in reverse. Between the diagrams, Weiland had written observations not of the patients but of the building itself, the rate at which frost travelled along a corridor, for inches per hour when the note B-flat was sustained, the angle at which mercury reflected a face upside down, 33 degrees, the supposed age of the crucified, the precise weight of a soul measured at the moment of expiration, 3/4 of an ounce, but lighter by a grain for every lie told in childhood. On the final page, dated the last day of April, the handwriting ceased to be handwriting at all, the letters had been replaced by pinpricks so small they could only be read by holding the sheet to the light, whereupon the whole spelled a single sentence, the line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side. The archivist, a widower named Horace Dill who had catalogued every epidemic since the Great Flu of '89, felt the sentence enter his mouth like a wafer of ice, and that night he dreamt of a ward filled with beds arranged in a perfect spiral, each occupied by a figure whose face was his own but younger, and when he woke the tin box lay open on his desk though he had locked it away, and the hairs were gone. He resigned the next morning, telling the mayor that certain archives were never meant to be reopened, and he spent the remainder of his life copying probate records in a country town where no street ran straight for more than 300 feet, as if the very map feared what might gather momentum in too long a line. The box itself was placed in the subcellar of the State House, shelved beside the confession of the Salem strangling widow and the unopened testament of the taxidermist of Beacon Hill, but even there it continued to breathe, a shallow respiration that kept the surrounding files coated in a faint white rime until a janitor sealed the entire shelf behind fresh plaster, though he could never afterward enter that corridor without tasting pennies and hearing, somewhere behind the wall, the low, patient hum that waited for the day when the plaster would crack and the line would be redrawn. The air. In 1849, a decade after the hospital vanished from the ledgers, a young woman named Cordelia Wyland appeared at the offices of the Massachusetts Medical Society bearing a letter of introduction sealed with the same lamp-couchant device once affixed to the Charitable Hospital's charter. She wore mourning of such deep black it seemed to drink the lamplight, and her hair, visible only at the temples, was the color of banked embers. The letter, signed by a Barbados planter whose son had read medicine at Edinburgh, requested that Miss Wyland be permitted to address the society on the thermal aspects of mortal dissolution, a subject so specialized that the secretary agreed more out of curiosity than courtesy. When the members assembled the following evening, they found the lecture room colder than the frost-laden street outside, though the stoves had been stoked since dawn. Cordelia stood at the rostrum without notes and spoke for 43 minutes in a voice so low the youngest doctors had to incline their bodies like reeds before a current. She described experiments conducted in the ruins of the old hospital, measurements taken with thermopiles of her own design, charts plotted to show that certain rooms cooled in a pattern identical to the contraction of a dying muscle, as though the brick itself remembered the moment of expiration and repeated it eternally. She produced a mercury thermometer whose bulb had blackened, she claimed, by exposure to air that had never breathed, and when she snapped the tube the metal inside rose not downward but upward, climbing the glass like a silver vine until it vanished into the cork. The society listened in the stunned silence reserved for women who speak of things no man has yet named, and when she finished they voted, without debate, to strike her remarks from the minutes. Cordelia bowed, left her black gloves on the table, and walked out into the night. The gloves lay there for weeks, growing colder each day until frost formed on the leather even in the heated room, and when the janitor finally tried to move them they cracked in two, revealing inside each finger a single auburn hair sewn into the seam like a stay of corroded wire. Years later, when the society moved to new quarters, the gloves were discovered again, untouched by dust or moth, and they were burned in the furnace by a porter who afterward hanged himself in the dissecting museum, leaving a note that read only, "I have seen the line and it is not straight." Cordelia herself was glimpsed from time to time along the wharves, always at dusk, always walking backward as though retracing a route she had already taken in another life, and sailors swore that if you followed her at a distance you arrived not where you began but at the vacant lot where the hospital once stood, the ground now level and grassed over except for a single rectangular patch where frost persisted even in July, shaped exactly like a grave for a person 6 feet tall but no wider than a child's arm. The orphan. In 1861, the city orphanage on South Street received a new inmate, a boy of perhaps 6 years, found wandering the north end with no name and no voice, carrying a shard of window glass wrapped in a strip of cotton gown printed with the faded initials BCH. The matron recorded him as Thomas Unclaimed, but the other children called him Frost Boy because his breath smoked in any weather and his palms left damp prints that dried white on the bedsheets. At night he stood at the dormitory window humming a single low note that rattled the panes, and by morning the glass bore a delicate tracery of frost in the shape of the star and square. The superintendent, a Civil War veteran missing 3 fingers, believed the boy merely needed discipline and set him to scrubbing the stone stairs with lye, but the water in his bucket froze so fast the bristles snapped, and the stairs acquired a sheen that reflected the sky like black ice. One February dawn the boy vanished, leaving behind only the shard of glass placed carefully on the windowsill, its edge filmed with auburn hairs frozen into the surface like specimens beneath microscope slides. The orphanage records note that the temperature in the dormitory rose to a comfortable warmth for the first time in years, but the warmth felt false, like the smile of a hostess who has already poisoned the tea, and within the month 3 children developed consumption of such rapid course they bled from the mouth while laughing at a nursery rhyme about lambs. The building stands today, converted into law offices, but the stair that Frostboy scrubbed remains perceptibly colder on the left side, and secretaries report that if you place your palm against the balustrade at 3:07 p.m., the exact minute the boy was last seen, you can feel a pulse traveling upward, slow as the beat of a heart imprisoned beneath 6 feet of soil that refuses to accept the burden of another unrecorded grave. The engineer. In 1884, when the city undertook to tunnel the first electric railway beneath the old hospital site, the chief engineer, a pragmatist named Royal Whitman who trusted only what could be weighed or riveted, ordered the excavation to proceed day and night. His crew sank shafts and shored them with pine. But at 23 feet they struck a stratum of frost so hard the drills snapped, and the air that rose smelled of carbolic and vinegar. Whitman descended in the cage to inspect the obstacle and found the walls of the shaft lined with a clear sheet of ice in which dark shapes were suspended, not stones or roots but what appeared to be hospital beds, complete with iron rails and striped mattresses, each occupied by a figure whose face was obscured by a film of frost yet whose hair floated loose, auburn, undulating like seaweed in a current that ran backward. He ordered the crew to blast, but the dynamite fizzled, the fuses burning downward only to extinguish themselves and reappear intact at the top of the charge, as though time within the shaft were reversed. Whitman, a man who had bridged the Connecticut in flood, felt the first tremor of a fear he could not name, and he climbed out swearing to reroute the tunnel 50 feet west. That night he dreamt of a woman standing at the foot of his bed, her face a perfect oval of frost in which his own reflection multiplied infinitely, each smaller image mouthing the same sentence, "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." He woke to find his wife's hair, normally chestnut, turned auburn overnight, and when he kissed her good morning a single strand came away in his mouth, tasting of snow. The tunnel was rerouted, but the western deviation intersected an old sewer main that collapsed, dragging a length of track and a work train into the cavity. Of the 12 men aboard, only the conductor was recovered. He sat upright in the crushed cab, eyes open, humming B-flat, his pockets filled with auburn hairs braided into the shape of tiny nooses. Whitman resigned, moved to California, and built bridges of iron that rang like bells in the wind, but he never again tunneled beneath a city street, and on nights when the fog rolled in from the Pacific he told his daughters never to trust the ground that feels colder on the left side, for it remembers the weight of buildings that once measured life by a different clock, one that drips instead of ticking, one that waits for the day when the last rail will warp and the tunnel will sigh open, without a hand to touch it. The photographer. In 1896, a commercial photographer named Adelaide Morse rented the upper floor of a warehouse overlooking the vacant lot, intending to document the changing skyline for a brokerage firm. She set her camera on the roof at dusk, exposing plates of glass coated with silver bromide that recorded every gradation of light. When she developed the first plate she found the lot apparently empty, yet in the center stood a rectangular patch darker than the surrounding grass, so black it seemed to drink the emulsion. At the edge of the patch hovered a smudge shaped like a woman seen in profile, her hair lifting as though in a wind that touched nothing else. Adelaide exposed a dozen more plates across the weeks, each at the same hour, and the smudge grew clearer, a face without features, a gown that might have been a hospital shift, arms extended as if measuring a line across the ground. On the final plate, taken during the first snowfall of December, the woman had stepped closer, and beneath her feet the dark rectangle had elongated into a perfect grave. Adelaide, fascinated, enlarged the image and hung it in her studio, but patrons complained that the photograph induced headaches and dreams of falling through ice. One night she locked the studio and walked home, leaving the plate in its bath, and by morning the silver had lifted from the glass entirely, leaving only the grave shape behind, transparent, so that when held to the light the viewer saw not the photograph but his own eye looking back through a hole the size of a child's arm. Adelaide abandoned photography and took up silhouette cutting, snipping profiles from black paper with scissors that grew colder with each slice. Her subjects, bankers, brides, débutantes, recognized nothing unusual in their portraits until they hung them in parlors where the temperature dropped near the wall, and the silhouettes began to lean outward, as though the paper remembered the weight of a body it had never possessed. Years later, when Adelaide died in the state asylum, the attendants found her cell walls covered from floor to ceiling with tiny black paper graves, each labeled in white ink with a date and a single initial. The earliest marked 1826, the latest the day of her death, and every grave shaped exactly like the patch of frost that still refused to melt on the left side of the stair where Frost Boy once grubbed. The stair that leads down into the earth beneath the city, the earth that stores every unrecorded breath and waits for the line to be redrawn. The librarian. In 1919, a reference librarian named Owen Lapham catalogued the private papers of the defunct Boston Charitable Hospital, which had been stored in the sub-basement of the public library amid the smell of mold and leaking gas. The crates were sealed with the same wax that had once closed the tin box, and when Lapham cracked them open he found not documents but layers of frost that sublimated directly into the air, leaving behind only a faint red stain on the wood. Beneath the frost lay a single ledger, its pages blank except for the final sheet on which someone had pressed auburn hairs into the shape of a spiral that coiled inward until the center was too dark to read. Lapham, whose hobby was cryptography, attempted to photograph the spiral under magnified light, but the negative revealed between the hairs a sentence written in pinpricks: "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." That night he returned to his boarding house and found his room colder on the left side. The wallpaper had begun to peel in strips that curled into the figure 8, and when he lit the gas jet the flame burned blue and emitted the low hum that made the bulb vibrate in its socket. He tried to report his findings to the library trustees, but the meeting minutes record only that Lapham rose to speak, opened his mouth, and produced no sound except the same steady note, B-flat, that continued until the chairman struck the gavel and called for adjournment. Lapham was granted indefinite leave. He spent his days walking the old hospital lot, now a parking ground for Model T trucks, and his nights copying the spiral into smaller and smaller scales until the hairs he used were his own, plucked one by one until his scalp resembled a map of trenches. When the last hair was gone he disappeared, leaving behind in his rented room a notebook whose final page contained a single dot of ink so small it could only be seen with a microscope, and beneath the dot the words, "The center is not dark, it is merely farther than light has traveled." The notebook was shelved among the library's ephemera, and it remains there today, catalogued under the call number MED 1826.1, though the catalogue itself lists the subject as thermal properties, see also cold, pathological. Staff report that on nights when the ventilation system stalls, the microfilm reader in the medical room switches itself on and projects onto the wall an image of the spiral at such magnification that the viewer appears to fall forward into the center, and those who have seen it describe the sensation not as descent but as reversal, as though the world had been turned inside out and they were walking backward along a corridor that smelled of vinegar and iron, toward a door that would open. Without a hand to touch it, a door behind which something measured time by the slow drip of a scalpel set gently back upon a tray. The widow. In 1932, during the slow collapse of everything that had once seemed solid, a widow named Mrs. Agnes Wyland, no relation she could prove, applied for relief at the city welfare office, listing her former address as the old hospital site, which she claimed had been her family home since 1826. Her hair was auburn streaked with white, her eyes so deep-set they appeared to float in violet caverns, and she spoke in a voice so soft the social worker had to lean across the desk until their breaths mingled in the chilly air. Agnes requested no money, only permission to occupy the toolshed that still stood at the rear of the parking lot, a structure no one remembered erecting. The request was denied, but the following morning the shed was discovered to have a new padlock bearing the Lamcouchant seal. And inside, on a shelf of fresh pine, lay a single scalpel, a chronometer stopped at 3:07, and 32 auburn hairs arranged in the star-in square. Agnes was never seen again, yet on certain winter afternoons passers-by report a woman in black standing at the edge of the frost rectangle, her hair lifting in a wind that touches nothing else, and if you approach she raises one finger to her lips in the universal gesture of silence, and you taste in your mouth the flavor of snow about to fall. The shed remains locked, the key has never been found, but the frost inside never melts, and on the anniversary of the hospital's closure the temperature drops so low the padlock weeps icicles that spell in cursive, "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." Those who linger too long find their footprints leading away not where they intended but backward along their own approach, and when they reach the sidewalk their shoes are filled with auburn hairs that cannot be brushed off but must be carried home, where they coil inside the left shoe and wait for the day when the wearer will retrace the path, walking backward into the shed that waits with its door sighing open, the scalpel on the shelf already warmed by a hand that remembers the weight of every unrecorded breath. The listener. Tonight, as the city rehearses another winter beneath neon and the low hum of turbines, the lot lies beneath a parking deck of poured concrete, its surface warmed by the exhaust of idling engines. Yet on the lowest level, where the lights flicker and the attendant's booth is empty, a rectangle of frost persists at the center of Bay C7, exactly 6 feet long and no wider than a child's arm. The security cameras record nothing unusual, but the guard making rounds at 3:07 a.m. hears through the hollow of the concrete a sound like wet linen being torn slowly in two, followed by the soft click of something metallic set gently back upon a tray. He walks faster then, eyes fixed on the fluorescent tubes that lean toward the west wall as if drawn by an invisible draft, and he feels the hairs rise beneath his collar because every man among them knows, without document, without testimony, without anything that could be called evidence, that the city has begun to measure time by a different clock, one that runs backward and drips instead of ticking. If you descend alone and stand within the frost rectangle, the cold enters through the soles of your shoes and climbs the bones of your legs like a vine, and you taste in your mouth the flavor of vinegar and iron, and you hear rising through the concrete the low, continuous hum, pitched at B-flat below middle C, steady as a tuning fork that has never been allowed to cease. The frost does not melt, it grows, a clear sheet in which dark shapes are suspended, not stones or roots but what appear to be hospital beds, complete with iron rails and striped mattresses, each occupied by a figure whose face is obscured by frost yet whose hair floats loose, auburn, undulating like seaweed in a current that runs backward. And if you remain long enough, though no one has remained long enough, you will see your own face appear among them, younger than you remember, eyes wide, mouth open as though about to speak a sentence that has already been spoken, a sentence you will carry home coiled inside your left shoe like a hair frozen into the shape of a figure 8, waiting for the day when you will retrace the path, walking backward along the corridor that smells of vinegar and iron, toward a door that will open. Without a hand to touch it, a door behind which something measures time by the slow drip of a scalpel set gently back upon a tray, a door beyond which the line is drawn, and you are already on the wrong side, and the humming has begun to sound like your own voice played backward through a speaking tube, saying nothing you ever meant to say yet everything you will someday be required to repeat, endlessly, patiently, while the frost climbs your bones and the concrete weeps icicles that spell in cursive, "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." And the last image, should anyone remain to see it, is the rectangle of frost expanding until it becomes a mirror in which the city itself is reflected upside down. Snow falling upward into a sky the color of spoiled milk, while the low hum swells until it drowns the sound of engines and the heartbeat beneath your ribs, and you realize the rectangle is not on the ground but on the underside of the world, and you are looking down into it, and the scalpel is already in your hand, and the chronometer has stopped at 3:07, and the auburn hair is already coiled around your wrist, tightening, gently, like the final period of a sentence the city has agreed forever to leave unfinished. In the winter of 1937, a man signing the register as Jonathan Frost took possession of the top-floor rear room of a boarding house on Charter Street, 3 blocks north of the buried hospital lot, paying 6 months in advance with bills that smelled faintly of carbolic and left a damp stain on the landlady's palm that did not warm for hours. He arrived with nothing but a leather instrument case and a portable gramophone whose turntable he reversed with a jeweler's screwdriver so that the record spun backward at precisely 33 revolutions per minute, the speed, he told the curious maid, at which truth becomes audible. Each night at 3:07 he placed the needle on a single-sided pressing of a woman humming B-flat below middle C, the groove so shallow the sound seemed to issue from the air itself rather than the horn. The maid, listening through the keyhole, heard the note travel the length of the corridor and descend the stairwell like a rope lowered into a well, and she felt the wallpaper blister behind her ears as though the lathes beneath had begun to breathe. By February the other boarders complained of dreams in which they walked the hospital's long wards barefoot, gowns flapping open at the back, while someone behind them counted heartbeats in reverse. One salesman, waking, found the soles of his feet blistered in the lattice pattern of the star in square. He fled without his shoes, and the landlady found them outside Frost's door, laces tied together, filled with auburn hairs that moved slowly, curling and uncurling like worms in thawing soil. She confronted Frost, who listened without blinking, his pupils dilated so wide they reflected her face as a miniature moon floating in twin pools of ink. He offered no apology but produced a second 6-month rent in bills crisp as new bandages, and when she took the money she felt the chill travel up her arm and settle behind her sternum, where it beat in counter-rhythm to her heart. That night she dreamt of a scalpel placed gently against her ribs, drawing a line so fine she woke believing she had been unzipped, and she found herself humming the B-flat note as she dressed, unable to stop, the hum vibrating the mirror until the glass filmed with frost that spelled in reverse, "The line is drawn." She did not evict Frost, instead she began to wait, listening for the moment when the gramophone would cease and the footsteps would begin, but the note continued uninterrupted, and by March the boarding house had emptied except for Frost and the maid, who now moved through the corridors backward, her shoes on the wrong feet, polishing the banister with vinegar and iron filings until the wood gleamed like healed bone. On the 1st of April the landlady opened Frost's door at dawn and found the room vacant, the window open onto the fire escape, the gramophone still turning though the motor was unplugged, the needle circling an unmarked disc that reflected the ceiling like a mirror of ice. On the bed lay a single auburn hair coiled into a figure 8, and beside it a hospital identification bracelet stamped with the date 1826 and the initials SW. She swept both into the dustpan, but the hair clung to her palm, tightening until she felt the skin beneath grow numb, and she carried the numbness to her grave, a grave dug in the nearest pauper's field because no parish would accept a body that hummed B-flat below middle C even after the coffin was nailed shut, the hum traveling through the board so that the gravediggers heard it rising from the soil for weeks, a low steady note that made their shovels strike sparks against the stones of the displaced dead. The stenographer. In 1943, the War Department requisitioned the abandoned Charter Street boarding house for secretarial offices, and a stenographer named Miriam Vale was assigned to the top-floor rear room, its wallpaper still blistered in the shape of lungs. She arrived with a portable typewriter and a jar of ink rationed for the duration, but the machine began to jam, the keys striking backward, the ribbon unspooling upward like film reversed in a projector. At 3:07 each afternoon the carriage advanced of its own accord and typed a line she had not dictated. "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." The letters appeared not black but auburn, the color drying to the exact shade of hair kept too long in a locket. Miriam reported the malfunction to the quartermaster, who replaced the machine, yet the new typewriter repeated the sentence nightly, and the imprint grew deeper until the paper bruised and the desk beneath began to show the same words carved into the wood. She took to working late, hoping to catch the moment of inscription, and one night she saw the keys to press in sequence though her hands rested in her lap, each strike releasing a breath cold enough to frost the window, where the star in square formed in reverse on the interior glass. She typed a reply, "What line?" And the machine answered, "The line beneath the skin you mistake for your life." After that the ribbon ran red, though the jar contained only black, and the sentences multiplied, filling page after page with case notes dated 1826, descriptions of patients whose names were her own misspelled backward, diagnoses of mortal chill and surgical remedy by reflection. She carried the pages to the base commander, who locked them in a file marked pathological or burn unread, but the file drawer froze shut, and when they forced it open the papers had vanished, leaving only the imprint of the star in square burned through the steel like acid. Miriam requested transfer. The request was denied on grounds of national security, and she was ordered to continue typing whatever the machine produced. By summer her fingers had blackened at the tips, the nails blue as winter moonlight, and she began to walk backward through the corridors, her shoes leaving prints of frost that melted into the shape of small graves. On the anniversary of the hospital's closure she failed to report for duty. They found her room empty, the typewriter still, the ribbon exhausted, the final page bearing a single auburn hair coiled into a figure 8 and the words, "Patient discharged, destination unrecorded." The quartermaster burned the page, but the hair would not ignite. It lay on the coals like a filament of ice until the fire went cold, and when the ashes were swept away the hair remained, tightening slowly into a noose that the janitor slipped into his pocket, intending to discard it in the harbor, but he carried it home instead, and weeks later he was found hanged in the attic by a strand the color of snow about to fall. Though not so fine it severed the skin without bruising, leaving a line so straight the coroner remarked it resembled an incision made by a scalpel set gently back upon a tray, the tray that waits beneath the world, collecting every unrecorded breath, measuring time by the slow drip of frost that never melts, the line that is drawn, and we are already on the wrong side, humming. The child. In 1949, a girl named Dorothea Vale, grandniece of the vanished stenographer, was sent to spend the summer with her widowed great-aunt in a rooming house overlooking the buried hospital lot, now a parking deck supported by pillars that wept lime in slow stalactite tears. Dorothea was 10, an only child who collected sounds the way other children collect shells, and she possessed the unsettling habit of humming a single low note while staring at empty corners. On the first night she heard through the floorboards the faint click of something metallic set gently back upon a tray, and she rose to follow, barefoot, guided by the chill that traveled along the left side of the corridor like a hand trailing fingers across a wall. She descended the service stair to the basement, where the air tasted of vinegar and iron, and she found a door she had not seen by daylight. Behind it lay a room no wider than a linen press, its walls lined with frost that reflected her face upside down at an angle of 33 degrees. In the center stood a child-sized bed of iron-painted institutional white, the mattress striped with faded cotton, and on the pillow lay a single auburn hair coiled into a figure 8. Dorothea climbed onto the bed and lay on her back, hands folded across her chest, and she felt the cold rise through the mattress until it matched the rhythm of her heart. Beat for beat, then slow, then reverse. Above her the frost deepened, forming the star in square in negative space, and she understood, without language, without fear, that the room was not a room but a negative, a photograph taken of the moment before waking, and she was the exposure that must be developed in darkness. She closed her eyes and listened to the building above her, the slow shuffle of many bare feet moving in perfect synchrony, and she began to walk with them, backward, her soles tracing the lattice of scars that had appeared overnight across her abdomen, fine as ruling pen, intersecting at precise angles to form a star within a square. When the summer ended she returned to her parents, but she no longer collected sounds. Instead she sat at the window of her bedroom, humming B-flat below middle C, the note traveling the glass until it filmed with frost that spelled in reverse, "The line is drawn." Her mother, alarmed, consulted doctors who found no illness, only a pulse that fluttered at 120 and respirations that scarcely lifted the blanket, and they recommended rest and warm milk, but the milk froze in the glass, the cream rising upward like a silver vine until it vanished into the rim. On the anniversary of her return Dorothea vanished from her bed, the window stood open, the sill filmed with auburn hairs frozen into the wood-like veins beneath ice, and on the pillow lay a hospital identification bracelet stamped with the date 1826 and the initials DF. The police searched the parking deck, but the frost rectangle had expanded overnight, its edges so sharp the asphalt curled away like scorched paper, and at its center stood a single bed of iron painted white, the mattress striped, the sheets tucked with baroque precision, and on the pillow a depression the size of a child's head and the low steady hum that made the concrete pillars vibrate like tuning forks. No body was recovered, the case remains open, filed under runaway, destination unknown, but the officer who lifted the bracelet felt the chill travel up his arm and settle behind his sternum, where it beats in counter-rhythm to his heart, and he has begun to walk backward through the precinct corridors, his shoes leaving prints of frost that melt into the shape of small graves, and he hums without ceasing, gently, patiently, waiting for the day when the rectangle will sigh open and the door will accept the last unrecorded breath, the breath that carries the sentence spoken in reverse. The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side. In 1950, the city planned to erect a memorial to the war dead on the roof of the parking deck, a granite obelisk that would catch the sunrise and cast a shadow straight as a surgeon's incision. The architect, a survivor of Okinawa named Malcolm Shaw, submitted drawings of a pillar 33 feet tall, its base inscribed with the words "Time shall not dim the glory of their deeds." On the day ground was broken, the frost rectangle bled through the concrete like a bruise, and the pneumatic drills stalled, their bits snapped clean, the steel ends blued as if by extreme cold. Shaw descended to inspect and found the frost had formed a perfect mold of the obelisk in negative, a cavity so precise it reflected his face upside down at the angle of 33 degrees. He ordered the cavity filled with concrete, but the mix would not set, it remained liquid, trembling like mercury in a bowl, and when he leaned too close he saw his reflection multiplied, each smaller image mouthing the sentence he had not inscribed, "The line is drawn." He revised the plans, shortening the pillar to 29 feet, but the cavity deepened proportionally, and he understood, without horror, only a weary recognition, that the monument had already been built, somewhere beneath the world, and what rose now was merely the echo, the mold, the negative that must be filled with breath rather than stone. He withdrew the project and resigned, moved to the desert where the ground remembers nothing. But on nights when the temperature drops to freezing he hears through the dry air the low hum traveling the telephone wires, B-flat below middle C, and he sees in the window glass the star in square forming in reverse. And he knows that the obelisk is still descending, poured of liquid breath, patient, irreversible, waiting for the day when the frost will sigh open and the shadow will fall not across the roof but across the heart of the city, a shadow shaped exactly like a grave for a person 6 feet tall but no wider than a child's arm, the grave that has always been open, the grave into which every unrecorded breath is lowered gently, like a scalpel set back upon a tray, the tray that collects the slow drip of time running backward, the line that is drawn, and we are already on the wrong side, humming. Tonight, beneath the neon and the low hum of turbines, the parking deck stands 33 feet tall, its roof level with the windows of the rooming house where Dorothea Vale once listened through the floorboards. The frost rectangle remains at the center of Bay C7, exactly 6 feet long, no wider than a child's arm, and the security cameras record nothing except a faint distortion at 3:07 a.m., a ripple like heat seen in reverse, collapsing into cold. The attendant making rounds walks faster, eyes fixed on the fluorescent tubes that lean toward the west wall as if drawn by an invisible draft, and he feels the hairs rise beneath his collar because he has begun to walk backward without noticing, his footprints filling with auburn hairs that cannot be brushed away but must be carried home, coiled inside the left shoe, waiting. The city has forgotten the hospital, the tunnel, the orphanage, the stenographer, the child, but the ground remembers, storing every unrecorded breath beneath 6 feet of concrete that refuses to accept the burden of another grave, and on nights when the fog thickens into milk the rectangle sighs open, a door without hinges, a line without ends, and those who linger here rising through the hollow of the world the low steady hum that waits for the last listener, the last breath, the last backward step, the last sentence spoken in a voice that is almost your own, saying, "The line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side." And the final image, should anyone remain to see it, is the frost climbing the concrete like a clear flame, shaping the obelisk in negative, the beds in negative, the wards in negative, the city in negative, until the entire world becomes a mirror held upside down at 33 degrees, and you see yourself lying on a striped mattress, eyes wide, mouth open, humming B-flat below middle C, while the scalpel descends, not cutting but joining, not ending but beginning, set gently, patiently, back upon the tray that has always been waiting, the tray that collects the slow drip of every unrecorded breath, the tray that measures time by the line that is drawn, and we are already on the wrong side, and the humming has begun to sound like your own voice played backward through a speaking tube, saying nothing you ever meant to say, yet everything you will someday be required to repeat, endlessly, while the frost travels your bones and the rectangle size open. And the door that was never a door accepts the last listener, the last echo, the last unfinished sentence of the Boston Charitable Hospital, 1826, charitable still, patient still, waiting beneath the weight of concrete and neon and the low hum of turbines that pretend to be time, while the snow that refuses to melt climbs the brickwork like a clear flame, and the line is drawn, and we are on the wrong side, humming.